A man in South Louisiana spits into a small plastic tube and mails it away, expecting the test to confirm what he already knows. His name is French. His grandmother's gumbo was French. The prayers at his church have been French for 200 years. But when the results come back, France is only a fraction of the picture. Underneath the French surname sit German lines, and Spanish, and Native American, and West African, all braided together into one man. The story he was taught about who the Cajuns are had ended about a century too soon. To understand how that happened, we have to travel to a coastline far to the north, and a story most of us only half remember. The version in the school books is simple and almost beautiful in its simplicity. In the early 1600s, French settlers built a colony along the misty shores of what is now Nova Scotia, and they called it Acadie. For a century and a half, they farmed the tidal marshes, raised their families, and kept to themselves, a quiet French world on the edge of a British Empire that was slowly closing in around them. Then, in 1755, the British ran out of patience. They ordered the Acadians off their own land. Soldiers burned the farms, loaded families onto ships, and scattered them across the Atlantic in an act the Acadians still remember by its French name, Le Grand Dérangement, the Great Upheaval. By most estimates, somewhere between 10 and 18,000 people were driven out over the following decade, and perhaps half of them did not survive the crossing, the cold, and the disease. The survivors drifted for years. And eventually, the story goes, they found their way to the warm cypress swamps of South Louisiana, where they rebuilt their French world in the mud and the moss, and became the people we now call Cajun. Clean, tragic, and French from beginning to end. Except the blood tells a different story. When a Cajun family sends their DNA to one of the big testing companies today, the result is rarely a solid block of French. It comes back as a mosaic. Think of your DNA as a deck of cards, shuffled and dealt fresh from every ancestor you have ever had, so that a single person's genome holds a hand drawn from dozens of separate lives. For many Cajuns, that hand carries French, yes, but also German, Iberian, Native American, and West African, all sitting quietly beneath a name like Broussard or Hebert. Now, one test cannot tell you which great-great-grandmother stepped off a ship from France and which one was born in a Houma village. It gives you proportions, not names. The rest has to come from the paper, from faded church registers and ships' manifests, and baptism records written in 3 different languages. But when the DNA and the documents are laid side by side, they agree on the same surprising thing. The people under the French label were never only French, they were an assembly, and to see how that assembly was built, you have to follow the threads one at a time. The first thread is the one everyone already knows, the Acadian core. These were the exiles from the north, and they did arrive, though not in one clean wave. They trickled into Louisiana across 20 years, a few families at a time, until the largest single migration in 1785, when 7 ships carried roughly 1,600 Acadians from France to the Louisiana coast. Here is the first thing the textbook quietly leaves out. By the time most of them arrived, Louisiana was no longer French. Spain had taken it over in 1762 in a secret handoff between 2 crowns, and it was the Spanish government, not the French, that paid for those ships and welcomed the exiles in. The Cajuns were planted in French soil that had already become Spanish, and there were not very many of them at first. Geneticists have a name for what happens when a whole population grows from a small founding group. They call it a founder effect, when a handful of original settlers echo down through every generation that follows, like a few voices filling an empty cathedral. That small Acadian core became the frame of the whole picture. But a frame is not a painting. Something had to fill the space inside it, and the neighbors were already waiting. That brings us to the second thread, and it is the one that surprises people most. Just upriver from New Orleans, there is a stretch of the Mississippi that old maps label the Côte des Allemands, the German coast. Because in the 1720s, decades before a single Acadian set foot in the colony, German families were already there, recruited from the Rhineland to carve farms out of the riverbank. When the Acadians arrived 2 generations later, hungry and homeless, these German farms were the established neighbors with food to spare and daughters to marry. And marry they did. Church by church, wedding by wedding. The German coast folded into the Acadian world. You can still see it in the phone book. The German names did not vanish. They were simply translated at the church register, the spelling softened into French, while the blood underneath stayed exactly the same. A family named Huber became Ubre, Himmel became Himmel, Wickner became Wegsbach. To this day, some of the most Cajun-sounding surnames in Louisiana are German ones wearing a French disguise, the original language gone silent in a single generation. A man who is certain he is purely French because his name and his gumbo say so may be carrying the DNA of a Rhineland farmer who never spoke a word of it. If the moments where the record and the blood disagree are the reason you are here, consider subscribing. There are more of these threads to pull. The third thread runs through those Spanish decades. For nearly 40 years, from 1763 to the turn of the century, Louisiana answered to Madrid, and Spain did not simply govern from a distance. It settled people. In the late 1770s, the Spanish crown shipped in families from the Canary Islands, the people history remembers as the Islenos, and planted them in the bayous south and east of New Orleans. Around the same time, settlers from Malaga founded a town they called New Iberia, a Spanish name still sitting on the Louisiana map today. These newcomers lived alongside the Acadians, stood as godparents at their baptisms, and married into their families the same way the Germans had. The Spanish thread is easy to miss because it left fewer loud surnames behind, but it is there in the DNA. A quiet Iberian current running under the French, the trace of a colonial power that ruled the Cajun homeland during the exact years the Cajuns were becoming a people. The last 2 threads are the ones the old story erased almost completely, and they deserve to be spoken of with care. When the Acadians stumbled into the Louisiana wetlands, they were farmers dropped into a drowned forest they did not understand. The people who did understand it were already there. The Homa, the Chitimacha, the Atacapas, and other native nations had lived in these swamps for thousands of years, and they knew which plants healed, which waters held fish, and how to move through a landscape that could swallow a stranger whole. That knowledge passed into the Cajun world through trade, through survival, and through marriage, and so did native ancestry, woven in so quietly that it left almost no mark on the written record, but it left a mark in the blood. And then there is West Africa. South Louisiana was built in large part by enslaved Africans and by free people of color, whose lives and whose lines braided into the region across generations. The line between Cajun and Creole in Louisiana has always been blurrier than any label admits. West African ancestry sits in many Cajun genomes today, the inheritance of people whose names the records too often failed to keep, but whose descendants carry them still. Picture it for a moment. A single Acadian family steps off a flat boat into knee-deep water somewhere in the Louisiana basin. They have crossed an ocean and lost half of everyone they loved. They own almost nothing, a few tools, a language, a faith. In front of them is a wall of cypress hung with moss, and around them, already living on the higher ground, are the neighbors. A German farmer whose name will be French within the decade, a Spanish family sent by a distant king, a native guide who knows the water. Over the next generation, this family will not rebuild the France they lost. They cannot. Instead, they will marry the German, trade with the native, baptize their children beside the Spanish, and quietly become something that had never existed anywhere before. Not quite French, not German, not Spanish, but something new, grown in the space between all of them. And that is the real revelation hiding in the DNA. We were taught to imagine Cajun identity as a piece of France that survived, carried across the water and kept intact in the swamp, like a candle shielded from the wind. The genetics tell us the opposite. Cajun was never a fragment of the old world preserved. It was a new world assembled, an identity built out of exile and adaptation, out of every neighbor who happened to be standing on the same patch of dry ground. The French name on the mailbox is not a lie. It is just the last surviving label on a container that was filled across 2 centuries with everyone the bayou threw together. Which brings us back to that man and his plastic tube. When his results load on the screen, he sees the whole mosaic at last. The German and the Spanish and the native and the West African, all of it resting under a French surname he never once questioned. For a moment, it might feel like a loss, as though the story he grew up with has come apart in his hands. But look again. He is not less than he thought he was. He is more. He is the living proof of a truth the swamp knew all along, that a people can be defined not by where they started, but by everything they were willing to become. If that idea stays with you, the way it stays with me, subscribe and follow the rest of these stories. The record and the blood have a great deal left to say.